concept of below 2 degrees warming, and there's a lot of numbers that get bandied around in the climate change debate, the 450 parts per million, 350 parts per million, and various other things. I was wondering if you could perhaps discuss what 2 degrees warming means for the planet from I suppose, an ecologist perspective, and also what you think we need if we're talking about young people's future. What a sustainable future looks like.
Sure. Look, could I just begin by saying that when we talk about 2 degrees of warming and the amount of CO2 that will bring about 2 degrees of warming, that's all based on what's called a probabilistic assessment of the science. No one can predict the future. No one can say exactly how much CO2 will take to warm the planet by 2 degrees, so we work on probabilities. And at 450 parts per million, there's an increasingly high probability that we exceed 2 degrees of warming. Once that 2 degree threshold is reached, what it means is that there is also an increased chance that the climate system will just start moving in one direction, and nothing we can do would ever alter that. Right? So it's a sort of point of no return. You can imagine it a bit like a truck perched on the top of a hill. It's really hard to get it moving. You've got to put a lot of carbon in the atmosphere to get it moving. But once it starts down the slope, it's almost impossible to pull. Well, it is impossible to pull it back. So that's the risk at 2 degrees, that we then end up in a world without any ice, a world totally warmed and utterly transformed with, perhaps 2/3 of the species extinct and massive impacts on humanity. So that's ultimately what's at stake.
Everything that can be done must be done, because, and what I tell some of my coalition colleagues who would be in the sceptic camp or denier camp is that even if they considered there was a 1 in 100 chance that these predictions would come true, and I'm not saying that that's not the case at all, but even from their perspective, they wouldn't get in a plane or in a car if there was a 1 in 100 chance of that plane crashing or the car's brakes failing. And that's to those who are very conservative about this issue, that's the sort of approach we need to put to them. This is about risk management, and there's no going back unless we fix it up now. If we get to the runaway truck scenario that Tim refers to, that's it. We can't fix it up.
While we're just on the political side, just really an observation. I think the thing with climate change to me is that, and something that really Amanda and Anna, I think, running AYCC have highlighted, that it's above politics, but unfortunately many of our political leaders still see this as a left versus right issue. So we have to get past this point, and it's really your generation, I think, that's got to make this very clear to politicians. If you want to be a groovy politician and get people to support you in the electorate, then you've got to have modern thinking. And regrettably, on both sides of politics, there are numbers in both state and also obviously federal, where MPs still see this as some ideological warfare between left and right, which it clearly isn't.
Clearly we need to do something dramatic about climate change, but we're not going to get it. While Rob talked about the political divide between left and right, but it's actually a political divide between the old resource-based economy and the brains-based economy of the future. That is the divide, and as long as you've got politicians from both Coalition and Labor who are firmly locked into the vested interests of the coal and the oil industry, no amount of change is going to come about, because as Al Gore said in the film, if people's income, if their re-election, if the donations to their political party depend on them not understanding and not acting on climate change, you're never going to get them to change.
Christine, you mentioned the influence of the fossil fuel lobby on the climate debate in Canberra, and I was wondering from each of the panellists, we've got a broad section of society. It's clear that the public supports action on climate change. We've got scientists, we've got non-government organisations, businesses, all wanting action on climate change. How do we break the stranglehold that the coal industry and other fossil fuel lobbyists have on Parliament?
Well, I guess one of the ways is to expose it. Now, in the US, they have got a political lobbyists register, where the lobbyists have to register who they are and who they are seeing, as well as how much they give to the political parties. In Australia, our disclosure, whilst the Prime Minister, and I welcome this, has established a register of lobbyists, it is a very weak register of lobbyists and doesn't really tell you anything. What we need is the same kind of legislation as they have in the US, so you know exactly who's been in seeing whom about what, and then you start to be able to expose and shine some light and get some transparency on it.
And the common thing that I got time and time again from national senators, from Liberal senators, was the whole issue of jobs, and they trotted out all these figures. They've got a real concern about jobs losses in places like the Hunter Valley and in Queensland in particular, and that translates to votes to marginal seats. So that's why I think the key to having a successful emissions trading scheme, to having a successful policy approach, is to manage the transition so that we can go from a high fossil fuel dependent to a low or no fossil fuel dependent economy. And that's what the key is. We need to get that transition right, because if we don't, there'll be enormous dislocation. That will translate into votes, and then you're back to square one. And that, to me, is the key to this. We need to get the transition right from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. If we're going to have that shift, we may need to make sure that it's diffused as a political issue, it's neutralised as a political issue, that we have the packages in place for that extra investment in renewables, that you actually have a situation in place where those claims can be countered. Because right now, that's the big thing that's stopping large slabs of the coalition coming on board with this. If that can be neutralised, then I think we go a long way forward into getting some meaningful bipartisanship on this.
I think it's absolute rubbish for two reasons. One is, if you look at the coal sector in Australia, most of the jobs are in the export sector. And no matter what Australia does with its own CPRS, it's going to have only a marginal impact on that. It's legislation in South Korea and Japan that's going to have a huge impact on Australia's exports. Yeah. So why are they fighting a battle in Australia? It's just an unanswerable question. The other point is that in the domestic energy generation sector, there are only 20 major plants in Australia that generate electricity from coal. They're not a huge number. The number of people employed there is not huge either. By bringing in this legislation, there's no way that's going to affect jobs and on a priori basis. First of all, because the government's investing so much in carbon capture and storage, it's only going to increase the number of jobs in the sector, if anything. You know? And if that fails, or that isn't pursued, renewable energy is a great employer anyway. And in some of these areas where electricity is generated, there are great potential for other renewable sources of energy. Geothermal energy in the Hunter Valley is a great example. So the jobs issue is a bogus issue as far as I'm concerned. It's never been substantiated. You see the most outrageous figures produced on it. You've only got it's such an emotive thing, you've just got to say jobs and everyone sort of gets scared, you know, particularly at the political level. We just need to look through that and see the truth. One thing that will change though is if we move from renewable energy, move from coal to renewables, there won't be as many unionised jobs as there was before, at least unless the new sector gets unionised as well. So that's a shift, that's a real shift possibly that we have to be aware of as we go forward. But jobs as a whole, I think it's just bogus.
I was wondering if we could now move on to a bit more of a discussion of the CPRS. Tim, I was wondering what's your perspective on the CPRS and if it should be passed?
I believe it should be passed. I see all of the flaws in the system. I can see that there's been too many giveaways, that some industries have been given benefits that, even though they're the industries that cause a problem in the first place, it sort of goes against the grain morally to let that sort of stuff happen. But what I see desperately is that we need to take a first step, and we need to take it in advance of the Copenhagen meeting so we can go there with at least some credibility. Now, I know that it's not going to be perfect, it'll be one step in a long journey, but as I say, the science is telling us that we don't have a lot of time. We have to see emissions peak in the developed world within the next 5 years. Delaying the CPRS or not passing it also risks our future potentially. There's risks in every direction. It's my personal assessment that we need to take the first step. Now I know and I respect the view that other people have that disagree with that, but I think that if we can start and see emissions peak in 5 years, in 5 years' time, the social climate, the political climate may be entirely different and may allow us to do much more. But we'd be very grateful, I think, to the previous generation if they'd moved early too, even if it was only a small way.
I think that from the AOICC's perspective, we don't support the CPRS going forward at this stage. And I think for us, Tim, it's that I agree with you, if it was a first step to somewhere, then it may be something that we would support. But I'm wondering, how are you convinced that this first step will actually get us the outcomes that we want, rather than locking us into outcomes that we don't want?
Well, what it will get us is to a peak in emissions. This is after 2 centuries of continuous growth. It'll get us to a peak of emissions within the next 5 to 7 years, and it's broadly complementary